Sign the deed or I'm calling the police." Her voice cracked like a whip in the dusty heat, high heels stabbing into the cracked earth in front of my porch like she was nailing down a new flag. Her manila envelope swayed like a judge's gavel, and her red lipstick didn't so much as curve as it cut sharp. Deliberate. War paint for a battle, only she seemed to think she'd already won. I stood behind the screen door of the ranch house my great-grandfather built with his bare hands, the same swing creaking behind me in the lazy Texas wind. And for a moment, I wondered if I was the one trespassing. Do you ever wake up and realize the ground under your feet has shifted, but the boots you're wearing still think they're on solid land? What if the house you were born in could be taken? Not by force, but by fiction. You're trespassing again. I said, gripping the door like it was the last door I'd ever close. My voice was calm, but it was the kind of calm a fuse has before it meets fire, and this ranch isn't for sale. Never was. She smirked, all polished confidence and silent menace, and pulled a paper from her folder like it was a magician's reveal. "Well, I bought it," she said, "paid in full. I've got the documents. This ranch is mine now. You're just squatting." I blinked, waiting for a camera crew to jump out from behind the mesquite tree and yell, "Gotcha!" But no one came. No laughter, just the sound of her heels brushing my porch like she was scraping the past off it. She stepped inside like she owned the air I breathed. I was still frozen on the threshold when she trailed her fake nails along the wooden frame of the hallway, glancing at my family portraits like they were decorations in a fixer-upper. "What do you mean you bought it?" I said, my voice losing patience. "I bought this ranch 2 months ago," she said over her shoulder, like I should have known, like it was something I'd just forgotten. "At a silent auction. I've been patient. Now it's time for you to leave before I get law enforcement involved." She wasn't bluffing. She didn't have to be. She had a plan, and I was standing in the middle of it, unarmed. "You didn't buy this ranch," I said, hearing the pressure in my voice now. "I own it. It's been in my family since 1873. She turned slowly like a villain from a southern noir. "Then someone made a mistake," she said, voice soft as a dagger, "and that someone isn't me." That was the moment, the freeze frame in the movie where you realize you're not watching a comedy of errors, but a premeditated heist. That was the moment I reached for my phone to call my lawyer. But before my fingers could dial, her assistant walked through the front door like a footnote in this absurd story, holding a real estate sign that read, "Luxury Ranch Living Up in House Sunday." "Where should I plant this?" she asked. That's when the loop opened. That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a land grab dressed in Prada, and it had started long before she ever stepped onto my porch. Let me take you back. 3 months ago, I first noticed the black Range Rover idling outside my property fence at Cedar Creek. We don't get tourists. We don't get passers-by. We're 30 miles from the nearest gas station and an hour from any town with cell reception strong enough to stream anything other than AM radio. When I saw the SUV shiny, arrogant, out of place, I assumed they were lost. I was fixing the fence line near the edge of the pasture, same place Grandpa used to tie the horses after branding. I waved. She didn't. She stepped out like she was appraising something she already owned, snapped photos of the windmill near the and made a call. I couldn't hear what she said, but her lips were moving fast, like she was sealing a deal with ghosts. I approached, wiping sweat from my brow. Polite because that's what folks do around here. "Hey there," I said. "You all right?" She glanced at me like I was a bug on her windshield. "I'm fine. Just checking out a listing." A listing, I repeated. "Yes," she said. "This property. It's mine." Then she chuckled, like I was a fool who hadn't gotten the memo. "Oh, honey, I'm a realtor. This ranch was in a foreclosure portfolio. My buyer's offer was accepted. I'm just checking it out before paperwork clears." I laughed. "I shouldn't have. Ma'am, my taxes are paid up for the next 2 years. There's no foreclosure here." That's when her face changed. Slight, subtle, but real. "Are you Wyatt Green?" "I am." Her whole energy shifted. She looked down at her phone and mumbled something before hopping back in the car and speeding off, kicking up a trail of dust like she was trying to erase her own footprints. At the time, I figured she'd made a mistake. But within a week, flyers started showing up in my mailbox, coming soon. Historic ranch for sale with actual photos of my house, my barn, even my horse, Bucky, posing like some magazine spread. I marched down to the post office, asked who dropped them off. The clerk shrugged. Realtor named Madison Lane. He said, real estate queen of West Texas. Apparently, I looked her up. Fancy website, high-end clients, flashy heels and flashier deals. But I didn't care about any of that. I just wanted her off my land. I left her a message. Civil. Firm. You're trespassing. Stop advertising property that isn't for sale. The next day, she showed up again, this time with a couple in tow, some out-of-town investors, wearing sunglasses and smiles like they were already on vacation. They snapped photos, laughed on my front steps. I walked out, calm but clenched. Excuse me, I said, but y'all are on private property. The couple looked at Madison. Isn't this the ranch you said was vacant? Oh, she replied sweetly. The current owner's temporary. We're in negotiation. I snapped. What negotiation? She just smiled, herding them back to the car. But before she left, she turned and walked up to me. You're making this harder than it has to be. She said, I've got buyers lined up. Just sign the paperwork and I'll cut you in. I stared at her. This is my family's land. Not for long. She said, you'll be gone before summer. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up poring over every document I owned: deed, tax receipts, survey maps. I knew what I knew, but she didn't need the truth. She only needed to look official. She came back again the next week, brought a landscaping crew, tried to install a model home driveway gate. I had to call the sheriff to get them off my land. Even then, she kept showing up. Her assistant, her clients. One time I found a drone buzzing over my pasture like a vulture looking for something dead. But nothing prepared me for the moment she walked in unannounced, dropped her envelope on my table, and demanded I hand over my family's history like it was a pair of old boots. She thought she'd already won. She had the suit, the documents, the story rehearsed, and she had law enforcement ready to act like her entourage. But she didn't have the truth. She didn't have my blood in this dirt. When the sheriff showed up and asked me to prove I belonged in my own house, I knew this was no longer about paperwork. It was about power. This woman wasn't just selling real estate. She was erasing legacy, rewriting history with forged ink. And unless I stopped her, she was going to win. But not here, not at Cedar Creek, not while a green still walked this soil. The morning after the sheriff told me to stay off my own land, I sat on my cousin Ben's porch 2 miles down the road, gripping a mug of bitter coffee like it was the only warm thing left in my life. Cedar Creek Ranch had been ripped from under my boots, not by guns or court orders, but by a woman in heels and lipstick. Waving papers and smiling like she'd earned it, Ben sat beside me silent, letting the words hang in the air like dust after a cattle drive. That Madison girl, he finally said, she doesn't move like someone bluffing. She moves like someone who knows what's coming next. I didn't respond. I was too busy wondering if I should have punched a hole through her damn real estate sign before the sheriff told me to get off my own porch. Instead, I was the one politely escorted away, like a trespasser in the very house where I learned to walk, where Ma was born in the front room during a storm in '52, where Grandpa used to tell stories by the fire that crackled like thunder in winter. But I wasn't raised to quit. I was raised to check the fence twice and trust the land more than the law. That afternoon, I went into town with a stack of every document I had: title deeds, tax receipts, utility bills, survey maps, even black and white photos of my great-granddad standing beside the first windmill we put up. I marched straight into the county clerk's office where Jake, a wiry man with dusty glasses and an old soul, sat behind his desk like nothing exciting ever happened. Jake, I said, voice low but steady, we got a problem. He looked up, saw my face, and didn't even ask what it was. Come on back, he said. He spread the papers out across his counter like a jigsaw puzzle and started reading through each one. slow and methodical. The way a man reads scripture when he's not sure if he's been lied to by God or man, everything here checks out. He said after 10 minutes, taxes paid, no foreclosure history, property lines intact, ownership's clean since 1873. Then he paused. But that word hit harder than any gunshot. But what I asked, he pulled up his screen, frowning. After the flood 2 years ago, some records were auto-flagged for review. System marked older parcels as unverified. Lot 58D, your land was tagged as unclaimed 6 months ago. My heart sank. What does that mean? It means someone could have come in and filed a purchase request, Jake said, and if no one caught the error in time, it could have gone through as pending sale. Who I asked, already knowing. He turned the screen so I could see the name, Madison Lane Realty Group. I felt something rupture inside me. Not rage, not fear, something heavier, like watching a barn collapse slow under the weight of its own neglect. But it's not finalized, Jake added. Her purchase was flagged as pending. Needs a signature from the land commission to go through. That means she doesn't own it. I finished. She's trespassing, Jake nodded. But she's acting like she already closed the deal. That's dangerous. Dangerous, I laughed bitterly. She's got a sign on my gate and strangers drinking wine on my porch. Then you better move fast. Jake said, file an injunction before that commission stamp goes through. I drove out of there like my truck had caught fire. But when I returned to the ranch, it was like walking into a nightmare wearing my boots. The front gate was gone. In its place stood a sleek, steel sign that read, Private Property, the Madison Lane Realty Group. Trespassers will be prosecuted. 4 luxury cars were parked along the gravel drive. Music played from hidden speakers. And there, on the porch my great-grandpa built with calloused hands, a group of strangers laughed over glasses of rosé, clinking like they were christening a yacht. I stood frozen, staring. A food truck was parked beside the barn, its tires gouging the dry pasture grass. The air smelled like barbecue and betrayal. Then I saw her, Madison, standing in a silver cocktail dress, holding a microphone, speaking to a small crowd about the future potential of Cedar Creek. Restored heritage meets modern luxury, she said. Imagine a golf course over those rolling hills, a spa retreat in the barn, wedding venues by the pond. Something in me snapped. I stepped out of my truck and marched across the yard. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A wine glass shattered somewhere. Get off my land, I yelled. Madison turned slowly, like I was the entertainment. Well, she smiled. Look who finally showed up. This is illegal. I said, storming up the steps. All of you are trespassing. There is no sale. You are guests at a fantasy. This man is under investigation, Madison announced, handing out brochures like communion wafers. He's being removed for unlawful occupation. We have documents. Show them. I said, show the deed. She pulled out a folder again, but this time I was ready. I held up the documents Jake printed, the system logs, the pending sale status, the unfiled commission signature. Your purchase isn't complete. It's pending. You're squatting. Not me. The crowd grew silent. A woman near the porch stepped back. A man checked his phone, scrolling fast. That's when Madison dropped her bomb. I have temporary occupancy, she said, granted by Judge Harlan. Signed yesterday. She held up a sheet. I snatched it. My blood ran cold. It looked official, stamped, signed. I'd been so busy chasing county records, I hadn't even had time to file my injunction. And now she had this, a permission slip to commit fraud. I stared at the signature. Something felt off. Harlan had retired. Or had he? My hands were trembling, but not with fear, with calculation. If she was lying again, I needed proof. Before I could speak, a massive blue moving truck rumbled up the drive. The driver leaned out the window. Work order says remove all property from the main house, barn, and storage. Where do we start? I turned to her, stunned. You hired movers. You were going to empty my home. Just preparing, she said, shrugging. Pending doesn't mean canceled. Behind me, Bucky neighed sharply, tied too close to the noise. His ears flattened, his legs kicked. Then the rope snapped, and he bolted toward the hills. Somebody stop that horse, someone yelled, but nobody moved. No one here knew his name. No one knew how to call him home. I clenched my fists, my vision blurred with rage. This wasn't about real estate. This was a siege. I turned back to the crowd, now half leaving, half confused. One woman stepped forward with a brochure. I thought this was a real listing. She said, "If this man really lives here, I want no part of this." Madison's smile cracked. A few more people murmured. Someone dropped a wine glass and left. "You're finished," I told her. "As soon as I file my injunction, I'll sue you," she hissed, "for defamation, for interference, for standing in the way of progress. Try me," I said, and walked back toward my truck. Then my phone buzzed. "Jake, Wyatt," he said, breath tight. "The judge who signed her order, he's been retired for 2 months. That document, it's a fake." My stomach turned. "Can you prove it?" "Already pulled court records. He hasn't signed anything in weeks, recovering from surgery." The weight of what he said settled over me like a storm rolling in over the plains. She hadn't just bent the law. She had broken it. "Send me everything," I told him. "And Jake?" "Yeah, we're done playing defense." That night, I drove back to Ben's, parked my truck under his carport, and sat in silence. Outside, the stars blinked like old friends watching from a distance. I stared at the sky and whispered to myself, she brought war to my doorstep. But she forgot I know this land better than she knows her own lies. And I wasn't going down easy. Not now, not ever. The courthouse smelled like old paper and anxiety. A place where history got folded into manila files and futures were decided with signatures that could either save or ruin a name. I walked in holding the forged occupancy order like a burning brand, my boots echoing down the marble hallway. Every step a reminder that I wasn't just fighting for land, I was fighting for lineage. Nate Hudson, my lawyer, was already waiting at home, a legal pit bull in worn boots and a blazer that didn't quite fit right because he hated suits but loved justice. I slapped the fake order on his desk, watching his eyes narrow as they scanned the paper. "This signature," he muttered, "doesn't belong on any legal document issued this year. Judge Harlan has been recovering from heart surgery since March." He pulled up the court's digital docket, typed with the precision of someone who liked burying liars with facts. And after a few clicks, he turned the screen toward me. Last order he signed was 2 months before this date. Madison used a template. Forge the rest. It's clean, but not that clean. I exhaled like I'd been holding my breath since the sheriff first doubted me on my own porch. "What do we do?" I asked. Nate leaned back in his chair, eyes focused like a sniper's. "We don't go to war. We drag war into the sunlight." Within the hour, we filed an emergency injunction at the county court, attaching Jake's county clerk statement, the real property history, and the full audit trail that showed Madison's purchase was pending and unauthorized. But it wasn't enough just to stop her from squatting. I wanted her exposed. I wanted her lease to rot in public. So we also filed a motion to compel the district attorney to investigate criminal fraud, forgery, and attempted grand theft. As Nate put it, she didn't just break the law. She orchestrated a con. And con artists don't stop, they escalate. I left his office that night with a copy of every motion filed, every affidavit signed, a war chest of paper and principal. But when I reached my truck, something was wrong. The door handle had scratches around it, like someone had tried to force it open. Inside, my glove box was hanging open, papers scattered, but nothing missing. It wasn't a robbery, it was a warning. Someone had been in my truck, not to steal, but to search. The files I had on Madison, the printed photos, the receipts, they were still there, but they'd been touched, slightly rearranged. Someone was checking how far I'd gotten. I called Nate immediately. "They're tracking me." I told him, "Not just watching, probing. He didn't even pause. Then we moved fast. I'll get the DA on the phone first thing. That night, sleep felt like a luxury I hadn't earned. I kept the lights off at Ben's house, the curtains drawn at 3 a.m. A car drove past slow, then circled back 10 minutes later. I logged the plate, sent it to Ray, my cousin, ex-federal investigator who I hadn't seen in years but had called the second this turned from legal fight to full-on war. Ray arrived by noon, stepping out of his car like a ghost from another life, bald, broad-shouldered, wearing a field jacket and an expression that made me feel like the cavalry had finally arrived. "She's not working alone," Ray said after an hour walking my property. "This kind of forgery, the timing, the confidence, it smells like coordination. At least one person inside the system is feeding her access." I told him about the clerk's flood mistake, the way the auction was triggered, the forged judge signature. He nodded slowly. "Then she's the face, but someone else is the architect." Together, we ran down everything I had, mapped out timelines, compared document metadata. Then he made a call to an old contact at the State Land Commission. 30 minutes later, we had confirmation the auction submission under Madison Lane Realty was fast-tracked through an internal channel not available to the public. It had a digital signature traceable to a login used exclusively by a clerk named Ed Barnes. Ray smiled darkly. "Gotcha." That same day, the sheriff received our injunction and posted it physically on the gate of Cedar Creek. It meant no more open houses, no more catered wine tastings, no more Madison walking across my porch like she was rewriting my family Bible. But the damage was already done. My barn had been scratched by delivery trucks. The pasture was trampled by tourists. My old water pump was busted from overuse. The land looked like it had been through a battle, and in a way, it had. Still, the news spread fast. Local headlines ran the story, "Land dispute escalates in Cedar County forgery, alleged in ranch sale." People started talking again, but this time, not with doubt, instead, with fear and curiosity. That fear reached Madison, too, because 2 days later, I got a letter delivered in person, not by a sheriff, but by a man in a black polo with a clipboard and slick hair. He smiled too easily. "Miss Lane is willing to settle," he said. "She'll relinquish her claim quietly, drop all occupancy filings, if you agree not to pursue charges or speak to the media." I stared at him like he'd just asked me to pave over my grandparents' graves. "Tell her I'm just getting started." He left without another word. But that evening, a drone returned. I watched it from the swing, hovering above the house like a wasp, unsure of its next sting. Ray was already outside with his gear. He tracked it by signal, followed its flight path west toward the ridge. The next day, Ray confronted Barnes at the land office. He didn't threaten him. He didn't need to. He just said one sentence: "We have the IP address and the timestamps. Your name's on the login." Barnes cracked, not immediately, but within hours. He emailed Ray a full list of documents he'd processed for Madison over the past year. Not just Cedar Creek, 3 other properties. One belonged to a widow. One was an abandoned church. The last was a failing horse rescue shelter run by a veteran. All had been tagged unclaimed after the flood, and all had pending sales filed by Madison Lane. Now we had a pattern, a playbook, a conspiracy. Nate took the file directly to the DA. That night, the sheriff returned to my porch, this time not to remove me, but to warn me. "She's not backing down," he said. "She's lawyering up. They want to call it a clerical mistake. Clerical mistakes don't hire moving trucks," I replied. "And they sure as hell don't forge judges' signatures." The sheriff nodded. "We'll be issuing warrants by morning, but you might want to sleep with one eye open. People like her, they don't go quiet, as if the universe needed to make a point." My phone buzzed 10 minutes later. Unknown number. A photo. Me, sitting on my porch, taken 20 minutes ago, from the tree line. The caption said, "This isn't over." I showed Ray. He didn't say anything. He just walked inside and came back with his Glock. "I'm going hunting," he said. "Don't open the door for anyone but me." That night, the stars above Cedar Creek didn't feel like old friends anymore. They felt like witnesses, silent, watching, waiting. Because now, I knew this wasn't about money. It wasn't about property lines. It was about erasure. And someone out there wanted me gone, not just off the lawn, but out of the picture. But they'd forgotten something vital. This land doesn't forget, and neither do I. 3 days after the sheriff posted the injunction, Madison Lane vanished without a sound. Her office in town was locked tight, blinds drawn, and when the sheriff's deputy returned with the warrant for her arrest, the receptionist desk was empty, the phones unplugged, the computer wiped. Her assistant, the one who used to hold open house brochures like they were sacred scrolls, was gone too. Neighbors said they saw movers late that night loading boxes into an unmarked van. And by sunrise, the space that had once broadcast her smiling face on giant luxury banners now stood cold and silent. The lights still humming, but no one left to flip the switch. It didn't feel like someone who had surrendered. It felt like someone going underground. Ray called it before the ink on the search warrant dried. She knew the warrants were coming. Someone warned her. She's got friends in high places, or at least ones with loose ethics and fast phones. We didn't sleep that night. We scoured everything, every invoice, every paper she'd left behind in public records, every video, every social profile. Then something broke open. Casey Rowe, an investigative reporter from Houston who'd seen the early court filings, reached out. Her message was short. "This is bigger than just you. I want in." I met her 2 nights later at a diner off Route 16, a place where truckers left their stories carved into the wood grain of the booths, and nobody asked why you were meeting at 2 a.m. She was sharp, precise, the kind of person who didn't waste syllables. She brought a folder and a recorder. "I've been looking into rural land transfers across Texas since 2019. She said, "Properties marked as abandoned due to digital misfiling. Many never were. The owners were alive, active. But the land was sold anyway." I told her about Madison, the forged court order, the open house, the drone. She didn't flinch. She just clicked her pen. "How many other names are in her files?" she asked. Ray was already working that angle. While I spoke to Casey, he was cross-referencing every transaction filed under Madison Lane Realty with land registry anomalies from the year of the flood. And the list was growing. 8 properties, then 11, then 17. Each one had some flaw in its digital trail, misfiled deeds, missing tax confirmations, or silent auctions slipped through without press notice. A network, a damn system built on quiet erasure. We had proof. What we didn't have was Madison. That changed the next day when Ray got a text from a burner account linked to an IP in Austin. It was a photo grainy, low light of Madison in what looked like a cabin kitchen, wearing a hoodie, hair tied back, phone in hand. The XF data placed it in High Pine Ridge, a luxury private retreat area 3 counties north. We didn't wait. Nate called in a favor from the district marshal's office. By dawn, federal marshals had swarmed a secluded log house perched on a hill with satellite dishes and a rented SUV out front. Inside, they found her disheveled, shoeless, her phone still warm from use, a laptop midway through deleting files. When she saw Ray and I standing behind the agents, she didn't scream, she didn't beg. She just smiled, slow and sour, like the devil catching a splinter. "You think this ends with me?" she said. "You're standing on a system older than both of us. You're just the first idiot to scream loud enough." I didn't reply. Ray stepped forward. "You're under arrest for forgery, fraud, and attempted grand theft. But we're not done. You're going to name every name." She was escorted out in cuffs, but she didn't look defeated. She looked like someone who'd seen the next move on the chessboard and was still smiling at the eventual checkmate. Back at the ranch, the dust felt lighter. The signs had been torn down. The open house banners burned in a barrel behind Ben's trailer, but we weren't celebrating. Not yet. The DA had her, but the system that enabled her still walked free, buttoned up in clerks' offices, land commission halls, and conference calls with real estate investors looking for undervalued rural opportunities. Casey dropped her first story that same week, The Ranch Theft Playbook, How Digital Errors Became a Goldmine for Scammers. It aired statewide, then national. Suddenly, Cedar Creek wasn't just a place, it was a symbol. People called, people emailed. A veteran from Lubbock, a retired school teacher from Amarillo, a church caretaker from Fort Worth, all with stories of land gone missing, of papers filed behind their backs, of threats, of lies. Madison became the face of something bigger, an operation that had stretched like roots beneath the state. The sheriff's department, emboldened by pressure and press, issued indictments, not just for Madison, but for Ed Barnes and two others tied to the Land Commission, fake notaries, backdated forms, forged death certificates. The rot had been there all along. Now the soil was finally turning. Meanwhile, I got a letter this time not from a court or clerk, but from a private group of investors, the ones Madison had duped. They were suing me, for breach of contract, $4.2 million. Apparently, they'd wired deposits to her firm, signed contracts, and now that the deal was void, they wanted someone to bleed. Ben read the notice over my shoulder and muttered, "They're coming after the wrong cowboy." I handed it to Nate. He scanned it, his mouth twitching like a storm cloud about to break. "They're bluffing, but we counter hard." He filed a motion to dismiss and a countersuit naming Madison and her shell corporation as the only liable entity. We also included the DA's confirmation of her criminal charges and a copy of the sworn deposition where she admitted I had no knowledge of her deals. The next court hearing was a spectacle. Their lawyers showed up polished, rehearsed, smelling like mahogany and arrogance. They accused me of enabling fraud by not defending my land publicly sooner. Nate stood and delivered a quiet, brutal dismantling. Evidence, witness testimony, metadata, drone footage. And then the final blow, a signed confession from Madison, recorded after her arrest, where she detailed how she scouted rural properties using internal government contacts and deliberately targeted owners she thought wouldn't fight back. The courtroom was silent when the judge ruled in our favor. Case dismissed. Madison's investors turned their sights on her now, clawing to recoup their losses. It was poetic, and it was far from over. Back at Cedar Creek, I rebuilt the gate with my own hands, repainted the sign, rewalked the property line every morning. But one afternoon, I got a package with no return address. Inside was a burnt corner of an old county map, Cedar Creek circled in red. On the back, written in thick marker, "We remember, and we're not done." I didn't need Ray to tell me what that meant. The war was bigger than Madison. She was just the first domino. The system she weaponized was still breathing, but now it was wounded, and wounded things lash out. So I loaded my shotgun. I fixed the cameras. I called Casey and said, "Let's keep digging," because if they were watching me, I wanted them to see exactly who they were watching, and I wanted them to know this land doesn't fold, and neither does the man who keeps it. It was just after dusk when the final knock came, soft but deliberate, the kind that didn't belong to a neighbor or a sheriff. It was the kind that arrived with a purpose too heavy for phone calls. I opened the door and found Casey standing there, rain damp on her shoulders, a flash drive in one hand, her face carrying the weight of something more than news. She stepped inside without a word, dropped the flash on the kitchen table, and said, "We found the architect." The word didn't land like a bomb, it landed like a revelation, not because I didn't expect one, but because I had nearly convinced myself this fight was over. "His name's Marshall Denton," she continued, pulling out papers, screenshots, timelines. Used to be a land commissioner. Retired 5 years ago but never left the network. He's been running shell companies through proxies, feeding names like Madison, the data flag properties, digital gaps, owner obituaries, even health reports. That's how they knew who to hit. Cedar Creek wasn't the first, and it sure as hell wasn't random. I felt my jaw tighten. "Where is he?" Casey didn't smile. "Private ranch in New Mexico. But the feds are watching him now. We turned everything over this morning. I didn't speak for a long moment. I just stared at the flame dancing beneath the kettle, trying to understand how deep this thing went, how far the hands had reached beneath the soil I thought was mine alone. They underestimated you," she added. "You weren't supposed to fight this hard. Denton has a quote recorded. He called you a soft-spoken hick with too much sentimental value. I let out a dry laugh. He got one thing right. Outside, the wind howled like it knew the truth was finally echoing loud enough for the mountains to hear. Over the next week, the indictments rolled in, not just Denton, two former notaries, a judge's clerk who had slipped unrecorded orders into the system for a fee, three realtors, two lawyers, and a tech specialist who had been erasing traces from the public records for over 4 years. It was systemic. It was designed, and it was cracked open wide enough for the public to see the bones. National networks picked up the story. Casey's documentary aired in prime time. She called it Erased: How Rural America Was Targeted and Fought Back. I watched it from my porch beside Ben and Ray, the three of us in folding chairs, a bowl of popcorn in the middle, and a silence that felt like ceremony. My face showed up in clips standing in front of the county courthouse, holding up the real deed, riding Bucky across the pasture like I had something left to defend. And maybe I did, because after all that, I got a letter from the Texas Historical Commission. Cedar Creek Ranch had been granted protected landmark status, immune to auction, tax seizure, or digital reassignment, forever. That word didn't feel real until I read it out loud. Forever. The soil felt heavier beneath my boots that day, not because it was burdened, but because it was finally being held with the same reverence I had always given it. But victory doesn't come clean. There were scars. My barn was still damaged. My truck still ran funny on cold mornings. And the legal fees, even with the investor suit dismissed, had drained savings passed down from 3 generations. There was no parade, no medal, just peace and paperwork. Still, I kept walking the perimeter every night, lantern in one hand, shotgun slung across my shoulder, not out of fear, but ritual. Then, 2 months after Madison's arrest, a black envelope arrived with no postage. It had been hand-delivered, no return address, no sender, just a wax seal pressed with an unfamiliar crest. Inside was a single photograph, my grandfather, standing beside the original Cedar Creek marker stone, one hand on the shoulder of a man I didn't recognize. On the back of the photo were 7 words, written in tight cursive. Cedar Creek was just the first ledger. I stared at it for a long time, feeling the unease rise in my throat like smoke. I took it to Ray. He examined the seal, scanned the image, and said, "That's not a message. That's a warning." We went back to Casey. She traced the watermark embedded in the photopaper custom batch, used only by one professional lab in Arizona. 2 days later, we were on the road, heading west under moonlight. The lab owner, an old man with a photographic memory and no patience for liars, pulled a dusty ledger from beneath his counter and found the order. A woman, fake name, cash payment, but she'd left something behind: a map printout with 3 other properties circled. One had already been under litigation. One had burned down under accidental circumstances. The last was still standing, an orchard owned by an elderly black couple who'd lived there since 1954. We drove straight there. The couple, Mr. and Mrs. Jordan, greeted us with suspicion until I explained why we were there. When I showed them the photo, Mrs. Jordan gasped. "That's Marshall," she whispered. "He came by here in '72, tried to buy us out. My husband nearly chased him off with a hoe." I looked at Ray. He nodded. "He's been at this longer than we thought." We helped the Jordans scan and protect their deed, then sent them Nate's way to bulletproof every inch of their documentation. On the way back, Casey looked at me and said, "You realize this is just the surface, right?" I nodded. "I'm not tired, not yet." And I wasn't, because what started as a battle for my land had become something else. A movement. A call to arms for every person who'd been told their history was expendable, their title negotiable, their legacy a placeholder until something more profitable came along. I received a letter from a veterans group offering free legal services to rural landowners. A university asked to document Cedar Creek for their American Folklife archive. A girl from Dallas sent me a painting of my horse, Bucky, galloping across the pasture with a caption that read, "Some things can't be sold." But not everything was comfort. One night I found tire tracks near the rear fence that didn't belong to anyone local. Another, I saw the shadow of someone on the ridge. Too still to be wildlife. And then came the second envelope. Another photo. This time, me sleeping on the porch swing. Timestamped just 5 days earlier. A note beneath it. Typewritten history makes enemies. Be careful where you belong. I installed floodlights. I reinforced the locks. I met with the sheriff and gave him every piece of evidence I had, even the ones I hadn't told Casey about. I wasn't afraid, but I wasn't naive. Somewhere out there, remnants of the machine Madison had worked for were still turning. But now, every time they looked toward Cedar Creek, they wouldn't see a target. They'd see a fortress. Because I don't just own this land, I am this land. And as long as I breathe, it won't bend, it won't break, and it sure as hell won't forget.